Welcome, everyone. This lecture, we're going to explore the Constitution and its origins, from the Enlightenment ideals to the creation of the Republic. We're going to delve into the philosophical foundations, the revolutionary struggles, and the critical compromises that shaped the framework of the American government. To understand the Constitution, we have to first look at the philosophical roots in the Enlightenment. Now, John Locke, who was an English philosopher, he was particularly influential during this time, and he argued that all individuals possessed natural rights to life, liberty, and property. He also proposed the concept of a social contract where people consent to be governed in exchange for protection of these rights. Also, what is very important that he was one part of his ideals were that if a government abuses its power, the people have the right to withdraw that consent to be governed. And this principle, and combined with the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights of 1689, these milestones, they pretty much formed the bedrock of the American political thought, and because it emphasized limited government and representative self-governance. Now, for over a century, the American colonies, they had a period of relative autonomy. The British pretty much left them alone over here in North America. However, the British also had what they call the 7 Years' War that ended in 1763. And that was a turning point because Britain had a lot of war debt from this war. So they had to try to figure out ways in order to pay for this debt. They looked at the colonies over here in North America as a place where they could tax the people and get money to pay for that war debt. And so they began imposing new taxes and restrictions on the colonies. The first was the Stamp Act of 1765. It was a first direct tax to the colonists, and it created a lot of protest. Then there was the Townshend Acts, and also a growing military presence in Boston, which led to the Boston Massacre in 1770. You had colonists who were protesting, and British soldiers fired on them, and 3 were killed, and this fueled the fire. And so, as you can understand, there's a growing resentment towards Britain. And the Boston Tea Party in 1773 was also a pretty defiant act, and it directly hit the British economic control, and that's why they did it. And so there was an idea behind all of this, a very powerful idea, in that taxation without representation is tyranny. And their argument was that only elected officials, elected assemblies that they choose, had the right to tax them, and not Britain or Parliament that was across the Atlantic Ocean. So they decided to declare independence from Great Britain. And after declaring independence, they were a new nation. And so a new nation needs a government. And the very first attempt of establishing a government were the Articles of Confederation. It created what they called a League of Friendship among the states. And this League of Friendship was developed from a deep fear of strong centralized power, and it deliberately created a weak national government. And this is basically because of the experience they had with Britain being very heavy-handed. There was no president, and there was no national court system. So the president's the executive branch, the court system is the judicial branch. There were no executive or judicial branch at this time. They had what they call a unicameral Congress. So they had a Congress, that one branch of government. But this branch of government had very little authority. For example, each state, regardless of its size, had only one vote. And the only thing it was really good for was guiding us through the end of the Revolutionary War. But after the Revolutionary War, it became very apparent that the Articles of Confederation were not adequate. There was a lot of weaknesses that became very apparent. For example, the national government could not levy taxes, and you best believe they had a debt from the Revolutionary War, the same way that the British had a debt from the 7-Year War. The new colonies, or the new government, the new United States French League of Friendship, as they called it, they had a war debt. So they should have been able to levy taxes on the colonies or the newly found citizens of the country, but they couldn't. They didn't have a national government, and it caused problems. They also could not regulate commerce between the states or raise an army. So they had no power to pay its debts nor defend their borders. And as a result, they were on the brink of economic collapse and political collapse because of the chaos that it created. So ultimately, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, it was very much shown in the Shays Rebellion of 1786. Excuse me. In Massachusetts, there were farmers who had a great deal of debt. Many of them were veterans of the Revolutionary War. But they rose up to protest the high taxes and foreclosures on their farm. So they're being levied high taxes by Massachusetts. And if they couldn't pay the high taxes, they would have their farms seized. And so Daniel Shays led a rebellion to shut down the courthouse to prevent judges from being able to seize their farms. Now, Massachusetts, as a state, requested aid from the national government. But Congress, being very weak, they had no power to act. It had no money or authority to raise an army. But the rebellion was ultimately suppressed by a private militia that was funded by wealthy Bostonians. And this sent a shockwave throughout the states. And it convinced people, national leaders like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, that the Articles of Confederation were failing and that a strong central government was needed and is needed for the survival of the nation itself. Now, in response to the crisis that they saw, they gathered together in Philadelphia. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered together in 1787. And their mandate was to revise the Articles of Confederation so that they actually had some teeth. However, once they got into the debates and seeing what they could do with the Articles of Confederation to adjust it, they realized that it was inadequate, and so they decided to scrap the Articles altogether and create a new government entirely from scratch. Now, these meetings that they had in Philadelphia, they were held in secret because they wanted an honest debate among all of the delegates. there was a lot of divisions, a lot of heated arguments. In the large states, they argued through what they called the Virginia Plan. They wanted representation in Congress based on population. I'm sure you can imagine large states with high populations that would benefit them. So, of course, they're going to favor that. But the small states, they had what they called the New Jersey Plan, and it demanded equal representation for all states. Slavery was also another issue. The southern states wanted to count enslaved people for representation, and the northern states they disagreed. It created an unfair advantage to the South if they were counting their slaves as representation and for representation and taxation, and those slaves did not get any kind of actual representation. And the fundamental argument was, how much power should this new federal government have? And that was the center of all the debate between the two factions. And so, two factions had to come to a compromise. Now, to bridge these divides, the delegates created a series of compromises. Now, the first was, and the most important, was the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise or the Connecticut Solution. What it did is created a bicameral legislature, satisfied both the large and the small states, and that's what we still have today, is the House of Representatives, and that would be based on the population. However, the Senate would give each state 2 members, no matter what the population was. There was also what they called the 3/5 Compromise. Now, this was to address the issue of slavery and how the slaves were going to be counted. Okay. Like I said, the South wanted them to count each slave to be counted as fully as a person so that they can get more representation, more power in Congress. And of course, the North opposed that. So they created what was a 3/5 compromise, which counted 3/5 of the enslaved population for both representation and taxation. Now, you may have heard, they viewed slaves as 3/5 of a person. It's not accurate. It was just based on the ability to count, to have a count of for representation in Congress. And based on what it says, what has been said about viewing people as 3/5 of a person, that would make more sense if you were saying that the South viewed that, but the South actually wanted the slave to count as a whole person, and the North wanted them not to count at all. So it was basically a compromise of representation, not of how they felt about the slave. Just to clarify that. They also created a system of federalism, and that divided the power between the national and the state governments to balance the need for a strong central authority with the fear of tyranny. So that's why you also had to have strong power of the state to counter the strong power of the national government. And we'll talk a little about the constitutional structure. And the final document established created a principle of the separation of powers. Okay, the legislative branch, or Congress, which is called, was created to make laws. The executive branch, led by the president, was tasked to enforce these laws. And the judicial branch, headed by the Supreme Court, was established to interpret the laws. And to prevent any branch from becoming too powerful, they created a system of checks and balances. For example, the Congress could impeach the president. The president can veto legislation created and voted on by Congress. The Supreme Court can declare laws that were passed by Congress and signed by the executive branch, the president. The Supreme Court can declare that law unconstitutional and unenforceable. Now, this setup, combined with the principle of federalism, the balance of the state and the national government, it created a government that was powerful enough to be effective and limited enough to protect liberty. Now, they drafted the Constitution. However, now they have to ratify it. Now they have to vote on it and make it so that they all agree upon it and make it the law of the land, I guess you could say. So it had to be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states. And it created a really fierce national debate between the two rival groups, which are the Federalists, which were led by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and the Anti-Federalists. And these were the people who feared that the new government would become too powerful. So the Federalists were the ones who argued for a strong central government. And they made their case in some essays that people still debate today, and it's called the Federalist Papers. And so the anti-federalists, who wanted to weaken the power of the central government for fear of it becoming too powerful, they demanded a Bill of Rights to protect the citizens from this possibly overpowering central government, potentially overpowering central government. So they had a debate, and the Federalists ultimately won, but they won by promising to add a Bill of Rights to the very first articles in the Constitution. So the first 10 articles of the Constitution is called the Bill of Rights. And this was very crucial to ratifying the Constitution itself. And so we'll talk about the Bill of Rights, and it was drafted by James Madison, who was a Federalist. And they're designed to protect individual liberties from government intrusion. For example, the First Amendment guarantees our most fundamental freedoms: religion, speech, press, assembly, and to petition the government for action. There's other amendments that protect our right to privacy, security, and due process of law. That would be the 5th through 8th. And the 9th and 10th Amendments were particularly important. They clarify that people and the states retain the rights and powers not specifically granted to the federal government. So whatever the federal government, we've defined their role and limited their power. So whatever other power needs to be enacted, that's what the state retains the right to have. Now, one thing that the framers who drafted the Constitution understood is that the nation would change. So they provided a mechanism for future changes or amendments to the Constitution in Article 5. And they made this process deliberately difficult, and it requires 2/3 vote in Congress to propose an amendment and to ratify by 3/4 of the states. That's quite a high hurdle to reach. And what it did is ensure that the changes are made only when there is broad national consensus. And over time, this process produced some critical changes, such as the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War. It abolished slavery and established equal protection under the law. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. And the fact there's only been 27 amendments in over 230 years, and this speaks to the document's balance of stability and flexibility. And it allows this document, and is the longest standing document, the longest standing constitution, I should say, in existence today. Over 230 years, no other nation has a constitution that's that old. Now, the relationship between the federal government and the states has also evolved. Okay, for the first 150 years, it was dual federalism, kind of a layer cake federalism. The national and state governments had clearly defined separate spheres of power. However, when the Great Depression happened, they realized there was problems, and it kind of shattered this model. And Franklin Roosevelt created the New Deal at this time. And so it created kind of an era of cooperative federalism. Instead of a layer cake, well, more of a marble cake federalism. In this model, the lines between federal and state responsibility became blurred, and the national government became an active partner in areas once just reserved for the states. And they would use federal funds, grant and aid given to the states to encourage states to pursue national goals. And maybe you hear about it today, where if the state doesn't do this, they will lose national funding. That becomes kind of a talking point, or a reason why states take on certain policies that the federal government kind of demands. Some people think it's kind of strong arming the states, but that relationship, that change, happened during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's tenure. And the main reason why is because after the Depression, to get out of the Depression, they created that New Deal. It had to be enacted, and the states had to be able to respond to it. So that had to be much more cooperation and incentive for the states to enact a lot of the New Deal actions, which interstate highway system, a lot of things that we enjoy today happened during the New Deal. Now, the Constitution, like I said, it's a living document. It's the longest standing Constitution. Over 230 years, it's provided a stable and mostly effective framework for government. And it just shows the framers' wisdom. Then they created a system that had balance, it has stability, it has flexibility, and it allows for change as the world changed. And the Constitution has evolved. It's expanded rights. It's redefined the relationship between government and its people. It's the supreme law of the land. And its authority, it derives from the iconic opening words, we the people.